Brucham Aboyim to the new series of lectures on hashkafacircle.com, which is entitled The Oral Tradition of the Written Law. Now, the title itself is, I would guess, cause for contemplation and discussion. What oral tradition can the written law possibly have? After all, doesn't the oral law emerge and come after as an interpretation of the written law? So, Mitzvah Hashem, in the upcoming shiurim, B'ezras Hashem Yisborach, we're going to actually look a little bit at how Chazal understood the nature of the Torah Shebechsav, the written law, the written Torah, and the relationship of the Torah Shebechsav to the Torah Shebe'al Peh. That is the relationship between the oral law and the written law, and hence the title, The Oral Tradition of the Written Law. Now, part of this, part of the ideas, at least the genesis of some of the ideas, actually were alluded to, in fact, maybe even more alluded to a series of shiurim, a series on hashkafacircle.com, which I gave a while ago on the Siman Kuf Chaf Hey of the Chazon Ish in Eirach Chaim. That is section 125 of the Chazon Ish in Eirach Chaim, of the Chidushim, the novel of the Chazon Ish. And there he discussed, it's a section in which the Chazon Ish discusses what he calls Seder Desinis Parshas HaTorah, the order and the giving of the Parshas of the Torah, which the Chazon Ish described, looked at the Chumash, and tried to understand the history within the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu, how the mitzvahs were commanded. As we see that there are several mitzvahs which appear several times, given Rabbi Akiva's position that the klolim and pratim, the general and details of all the commandments, the mitzvahs were given on Har Sinai. So how do we account for the fact that we see that several mitzvahs appear several times in different Chamishi Chumshay Torah, some in Shemai, some in Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, and that there are changes in the way the Torah reveals these mitzvahs to us? So the Chazon Ish there said, and perhaps not a cryptic, but rather a very cursive language, that the changes that we see in the mitzvahs as they appear along the course of the Chumash come to allude to us to the oral law as Chazal used it in interpreting the written law. Now, exactly what Chazon Ish said is not entirely clear. He was very, very brief. But nonetheless, these lectures which I'm going to give are actually going to expand and perhaps even expound upon the idea of the Chazon Ish. And what I want to do is actually I want to arrive at, in fact, an understanding, a thorough understanding of the text of the Torah Shebechsav as it was understood by Chazal, by the sages, Zichronim Levracha, and as a result, perhaps we can actually gather and garner a tremendous amount of insight into the actual Chumash itself and to the very nature of the relationship between the written law and the oral law, that is the Torah Shebechsav and the Torah Shebe'al Peh. So, in Mitzvah Hashem, this will be a series of shiurim devoted to this subject matter. The first shiurim, the first lectures, I'm not sure how many lectures that will be, that we never know until we get there, will actually discuss in general the nature of the text of the Chumash and the nature of the Chazal's understanding of the relationship between the text of the Chumash and the oral law. And afterwards, I actually want to go into actually several examples. We go into several what you call sugyas in the Torah Shebechsav, in which I want to perhaps use the tools which I hope to develop in the initial lectures, initial shiurim, in order to further understand the very nature of the text of these sugyas, of these laws, as they appear in different parts and in different expressions within the Chumash itself. B'ezras Hashem, B'ezras Hashem Yisborach. Okay, now, I want to begin with a Gemara in Gittin in Daf Samach Amud Aleph. The Gemara discusses a very, very important question, and I think this is the question that really we're going to actually focus on. In fact, actually, this is the question which I hope in Mitzvah Hashem to somewhat answer at the end of all the shiurim, namely, how was how did Moshe Rabbeinu, Olav Hashalom, write down the Torah? In other words, how was the written Torah written down? And interestingly enough is that actually, this is actually discussed in a Gemara in Gittin, Daf Samach Amud Aleph, folio 68, side A, and the Gemara Chazal present to us a machlokas of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So on Daf Samach Amud Aleph, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, says Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Bana, in the name of Rabbi Bana, Torah, the Torah, Megillah Nitna. The Torah was given in the Torah was given, right, in a series of Megillas. In other words, each section of the Torah was given, right, in a series of Megillas. Shenema az amalti hinei basi Megillah sefer kosav alai. Now, what does it mean was given? I'm actually translating it, but actually, according to it seems the way Rashi learns, Megillah Nitna means it was written down. In other words, as Moshe Rabbeinu apprehended his nevuah from a Kodesh Baruch Hu, right? Each Megillah, which means every section of the Torah, right? He wrote it down. So in other words, the Torah was written down piecemeal.
Why does this imply written down? Because the word Megillah?
We'll see. Actually, from Reish Lakish's position, we'll see how Reish Lakish is going to. In fact, actually, from his disagreement, we'll be able to garner the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay? So that's what it says, Kosav Alai. Also, too, a Megillah is always, in fact, actually something which is written down. Megillah's Tainis, Megillah's Torim, those are the Sfarim which Chazal always refer to things which are written down. Rashi says in Erevin that, in fact, the only thing that was written down in the time of Talmud was actually Megillah's Tainis. So Megillah always refers to something which is written down. And it says, Megillah's Sefer Kosav Alai. Okay, so in other words, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Torah was written down piecemeal, as it was revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu. It was written down. That's the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Sherira Gaon, no, the Torah was written down all at once. All at once. Chasuma nitna means written down all at once, right? Shenema, as it says, right? Lakoach es sefer Torah hazois, right? Take this Sefer Torah, which means at that point, right, it was actually written down. Okay? So, now let's look at Rashi. We'll look at Rashi, right? Kosav alai. Mi'az nit the Torah is kalti bave et shtei b'nai secha. Right? In other words, it says, Alma Megillah Ika Mishun de Betchila Nechtava Megillah Reishis, Vada Megillah Snoyach, Vada Megillah Avram, Vada Kama Megillah Avram Kosav Alai. In other words, basically, Rashi explains the way I explained it. In fact, actually, the Torah is written down piecemeal. And Chasuma, it says, Gemura Musayemis B'Shleima. In other words, basically, according to Reish Lakish, the entire Torah was written all at one time, at the very end of the Aboy Mishan in the Midbar. That's Reish Lakish's opinion, yeah.
I may be preempting the rest of the shiur, but
yes.
Why Megillah Nitna, it's not what I would have thought that the Gemara is saying that each event as it happened in the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu was written down, but rather Rashi says that even when Moshe wrote down Bereshis, which had already happened, he still wrote it down piece by piece, was given to him in pieces rather than...
I don't know what your question is, but the Torah was written piecemeal.
But it wasn't... I had understood that Bereshis was given wherever, Mara or...
No, Rashi says no. Rashi says...
Even Bereshis was given Megillah.
No, Rashi says Noach, etc., etc.
And there's no reason, though, for...
I know, that's right, but I think Megillah, so on. The Gemara is speaking about the entire Torah.
I understand, but there's no... Is there any reason why Bereshis would be given separately than Noach?
That I don't know. What's called Megillah, I'm not sure. Clear. It could possibly be that, there was the first parsha of the Torah before there are... Well, we have what's called the Parshas Tumas and Psuchos, right? So therefore, Avram, in other words, I don't know. I can't answer that question right now. Right. But I think good Rashi is giving Lamashal example. In other words, Rashi can't refer to me to the actually Parshas Tuma and the Sunnah because it would take the entire page and quote the Basar. Rashi just gives an example. Bereshis, Noach.
Parshas Korach and Parshas Meraglim.
Okay, fine. He started from the beginning. That's not a. That's. Okay, fine. Anyway, but then he gets like this. So in other words, we have here a machlokas, right? We have a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the Torah was written down piecemeal. And I guess at the very end, right, the Torah was compiled. Now, of course, that doesn't, necessarily mean that it was written down piecemeal. So the way we get it is the actual piecemeal historical writing of Moshe Rabbeinu, because we have a klal, right? Ein muchal mukta b'Torah. So what we'd have to say, in a certain sense, is that what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that even though the Torah was written piecemeal, nonetheless, the final, I'm going to call it, quote-unquote, redaction by Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, al pi hagvura, also took place at the very, very end of the Aboim Shana. That's what Rabbi Yochanan seems to be saying. Whereas Reish Lakish seems to be something totally different. According to Reish Lakish, the entire Torah was written down at the end of Aboim Shana, at the 40 years, at the very end of Devarim. Meaning what? That in the 40 years before that, the Torah was literally an oral tradition which is finally written down at the end of the 40 years, at the end of Devarim. So we have here a very, very interesting quote-unquote dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish in the nature of the text of the Torah. Is the text of the Torah somehow a series of texts which were at a certain point, al pi hagvura, redacted at the very, very end after everything was written down? Or was in fact after the Torah itself a type of an oral tradition which was transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu al pi hagvura throughout the 40 years? And only at the very end of the 40 years did a text emerge. Now, of course, it's clear that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are not, engaged in a historical debate, a historical argument. I mean, clearly, Klal Yisrael has a Messianic tradition, right, how the Torah was written down. It's unlikely and for sure absurd to think that there is actually an argument on historical facts. But rather, what I would like to suggest is that what Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are presenting are two ways of understanding a text. How do we understand a text? Or, let's put it this way, two types of a text. Of course, the Torah is one text. But there are two types of texts, or I would say two ways in which a text is created. In other words, there are two ways of creating a text. The first way of creating a text, and I'm going to call it that the creation theory of the text, the textual theory of creation, is that actually there is no text. There's an oral tradition, and then at one point in time, this oral tradition culminates in what's called a text. But prior to the establishment of the text, there is no text. People are speaking, discussing, at the very end, they write down a text. That's called the creation theory of text, or the creation aspect of a text. Creation structure of text.
It's not the Torah.
We're going to, right, this is a general text, right. And then there's a second theory of text, that really, we have what's called or texts. In other words, basically, we have a series of texts, right? The text might come from different traditions, different schools, etc., many different points in history. And then someone comes along, a group of people comes along, and what's called redacts the text, right? And this is also represents the emergence of a text. But I would call this is not textual creation. I would call this textual redaction. In fact, actually, I think that we have the expressions here. This is what's called textual creation and textual redaction. In other words, redacting a text is different from creating a text. A text is created, right, where there is no text before that, but rather some type of a oral tradition culminates in the creation of a text. That's called textual creation. But then there's a text that comes from redaction. Namely, what we have is we have a series of texts, or texts that appeared previously in history, and then someone comes along and decides to somehow put the text together. Doesn't necessarily mean there's a hodgepodge of text. There's a very deep, a deep wisdom and understanding of the text and the way the texts are put together and redacted. And this I would call is the act of redaction. Okay, now I'm going to leave the Chumash now. I'm probably going to leave the Chumash now for the rest of this year. And what I'm going to do is I want to explore how these two concepts of textuality, of formation of text, namely textual creation and textual redaction, actually appear in Chazal and the Rishonim and the commentaries. Okay? Now, I want to begin with probably the most important document which details, describes the development of the Torah Shebial Peh, the history of Torah Shebial Peh, and that is, of course, the Iggeret of Sherira Gaon. Okay? The edition which I have in front of me is, I guess, the standard edition, which is edited by a person, Dr. Binyamin Menashe Levin. And in this edition, of course, he presents the two famous manuscripts, which are the have been called the Spanish manuscript and the French manuscript. And of course, we know that the French manuscript is for sure the most accurate and authentic manuscript. It's very interesting how many people have quoted this text of Sherira Gaon, and in my opinion, not that I've seen the entire literature, somehow miss what I would say to be one of the most central ideas in the Iggeret, in his epistle. Namely, the answer to the first question that he asks as he begins the epistle, the Iggeret. The Sherira Gaon is not, the question that's presented of Sherira Gaon is that if we understand that the Mishnayos come from, let's say, what's called Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, that's in the question. David Tzvi wants to say, along the course of Sherira Gaon, he decides that the Mishnayos actually came from Hillel, but we'll actually discuss that. But if we understand the Mishnayos come from Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, so how is it, why is it that the Mishnayos, which we have in the Mishnayos, in the Talmud, Bavli Yerushalmi, only quote Tanoim from, at most, not more than 150, 200 years before the Churban HaBayit, destruction of the temple. In other words, we don't have Tanoim quoted in the Mishnah that nearly go back to Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. The only Tanoim that are really quoted are later Tanoim that lived much closer to the Churban HaBayit, and later on until the 3rd century, until we have Rebbe and Rabbi Nosson. That's the question. It's a Sherira Gaon. In other words, and this is a very, very important question, because if you want to claim that the Mishnayos or Masechah, they weren't invented by Hillel and Shammai, right? So how come, with the few exceptions of Yosef ben Yoaza, etc., we see that the Mishnayos, they're known as being quoted from back to the point of time that we are claiming the Mishnayos stem from. Yeah.
Why does Masorah only go back to Anshe Knesset HaGedolah?
That's another question. Which actually I will address a little bit later on. But in other words, everybody, those of you who have studied Chachmat, but it's called Chachmas Yisrael, right? Which, according to Rav Kook, in a famous speech he gave at the opening or the laying of the beginning of foundation of the the Harry Fischel Institute, there, Rav Kook claimed that Chachmas Yisrael is part of Gufei Torah. That's his quote there. But we all know that in Chachmas Yisrael we have a very famous dispute between Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, the famous Mechaber of the Torah HaRishonim, and between Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, Mechaber of many Sfarim, including HaMishnah Rishona, the Elshta Mishnah, the Elster Mishnah, not so I'm speaking German or Yiddish, but in any case, of course, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman wanted to claim Mishnayos come from the time of Hillel and Shammai, and Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, with tremendous kanois, Gedaka B'Kodesh, right, argued very strongly that in fact the Mishnayos, Chas v'Shalom, come from Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Before that, I'll get to that. But yeah,
just historically, so I know which one came first. No, David Tzvi Hoffman was earlier than.
David Tzvi Hoffman is early on. Right. David Tzvi Hoffman, I think, is probably the end of the 19th century. Right.
And Dor Rishonim is the turn. Dor Rishonim
is the turn of the century. World War I. He establishes the first Aguda convention. I think it was Reb Chaim who called him on to establish the first Aguda convention. I'm not sure how he's better well known as a historian as the founder of the Aguda convention. I think he was a German. He was a Yekke. Right. He was a Yekke of David Tzvi Hoffman. He was a Yekke who became Litvish. David Tzvi Hoffman was a Hungarian who became German. Just means that hashkafas are not necessarily genetic. In any case, we know there's a famous machlokes. The Mishnayos begin with Anshe Gadol. They begin with Hillel and Shammai. Now the fact is that both, among other things, bring rayas from the Iggeret shiur Gaon, because the assumption of shiur Gaon is that the Mishnah is actually, in fact, Stefan Anshe Gadol. I mean, Tavtzvi is a guy later on. I don't want to go into right now that they come from Hillel and Shammai. But in any case, the point is, the basic point which I want to establish is that this is the question asked by a shiur Gaon. Now, I challenge you, listeners, those of you who are watching or listening, to survey the literature. Where is the answer? Where is the answer? He goes on and brings rayas and brings proofs that, for example, that even, in other words, that a Havayis Abayah V'Rava were known by Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, etc., rayas like this. He brings many chazals to indicate that the disputes upon Leda Morayim took place in earlier time. Very, very good. But what's the answer to the question? So I claim the answer to the question is actually in the Levin edition on page 22. In page 22, it's interesting that the answer, it's not clear. In my opinion, it's clearly the answer. But it comes sort of as part of a discussion. The Iggeret shiur Gaon is it's organized in a very interesting way. Let's put it this way. We'll be diplomatic. In other words, the major point is not stated, at least explicitly, but somehow you have to really understand what he's saying to understand the major point. Now, which could possibly be that the Iggeret was written not only as coming to teach someone something, but also as a type of a diatribe against the Karaim. So, that's usually what happens. First you give it, first you send out the rhetoric, the kanois, and then you come to the major point. Anyway, on page 22, I'm reading from the French edition. As I said before, the French version is the most accurate version, but I don't think there's really much of a difference here. He says, in the early generations, kol chad v'chad, each person, which means each Rebbe, each teacher, megabel lahoin letalmidim, would teach to his talmidim, ka'adam shebesapel lechaveiroi, like a person speaks to his friend, be'ez loshin shiyotze, in any language that he wanted. In other words, Rav Sherira Gaon tells us that, in fact, the Mesila, the transmission of the Torah Sh'B'al Peh, was really a private relationship, a private conversation between Rebbe and Talmud. So therefore, here we have the answer. For sure there was a transmission of the Torah Sh'B'al Peh from the Talmud Gadol. But what I want to claim is, Rav Sherira Gaon is saying, is that it wasn't transmitted with a text, but rather each Rebbe would teach the Talmud in the language in which they spoke, in the form, the manner, the syntax, semantics, whatever was unique to that Rebbe, in which he would mention the Torah. Beginning at a later point with what's called, I would call the Tanaim, what we call the Tanaim.
After the Sukkah.
Right. Then after the Sukkah, after that, all of a sudden the Torah is transmitted through a text. Then already you have what you might call the text of the Mishnah. Now, this is what I claim is Rav Sherira Gaon's answer. Sherira Gaon's answer is one has to distinguish between an oral transmission without a text and an oral transmission with a text. That's what Rav Sherira Gaon is saying. You have a question?
Clarification. When Rabbi Triebitz talks about the ur text of the Mishnah, he means an ur text from Hillel and Shammai. That's when it goes.
Well, we have at the end of Kalim, right?
Yeah, and in Psachim as well.
That's true, but that's an earlier text.
But I mean, that's not. He's not saying back down.
No. There's a text. For example, Ashreichem Kalim Yitnasim B'Tumah Yatzasim B'Tayra. Says Rabbi Yossi. Says Rabbi Eger there in the Mishnayos. Taisus Rabbi Kiva in the Mishnayos, we see that there was a Masechtas before Rebbe, but there was a text of Rabbi Yossi.
Right. So
Rebbe built upon that text.
So that text is 2 or 3 generations before Rebbe.
That's right, and Chanabi, right? That's right, and that's that. The Rashi we're going to speak about not this time, next time. A lot of Gilmud Beis and Bava Metzia, for example, Rashi describes in detail how Rebbe compiled the Mishnayos. But in other words, here we're speaking about the emergence of the text. Now, you spoke about the Zugais, which is important, because I want to bring here 2 rayas, 2 sources for Rav Sherira Gaon's statement. Okay? Two sources in Shas. One source is a Gemara, which I'm sure you're familiar from the shiurim of the Chazon Ish. It's the first Gemara in Tezvav Amud Beis in Temurah. There the Gemara says, right? Omer Rav Yehuda Mashmuel, right? Mimois Moshe Achamesh Yosef ben Yaza, from the time of Moshe until Yosef ben Yaza passed away. How you lamedim Torah kamesh Rabbeinu? They would teach Torah like Moshe Rabbeinu. From afterwards until Moshe Rabbeinu. I want to claim that Yosef ben Yaza is the point, and that afterwards he creates a text. In fact, actually, Yosef ben Yaza is probably the earliest Tana that's mentioned in the Mishnayos. Just about. Right after that is Hillel v'Shammai.
He's the beginning of the Sukkos.
Hillel Shammai.
No.
Yosef ben Yaza is beginning.
Yosef is the beginning of the Sukkos, and Hillel is the end of the Sukkos.
Okay, fine. There we go. That's what I want. That's what I want to say. Oh, very, very good. No, but that's what I want to say. In other words, in fact, actually, why do we have Sukkos? Once it's a text, it's a machlokas. In other words, if we all get together and discuss something and come to an agreement, but once it's a text, each can either argue on a text or present a different text. So, in other words, what I want to say is here we can pinpoint to this Gemara that in fact, actually, the beginning of the emergence of the text, the creation of the text of the oral law, which is the Mishnah, this in fact actually takes place around the time of Yosef ben Yaza or afterwards.
We still don't really find the Zugos in the Mishnah itself.
Fine, but I'm just saying, but Yosef ben Yaza we do find.
Yeah, I'm saying, apart from Pirkei Avos.
Okay, fine. Speaking in general. Okay. Yeah. Now, I want to bring another raya to the Sherira Gaon. It's a Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Chaf Amud Aleph says, right? Omer Reish Lakish, Chaf Amud Aleph, right? Shebetchila, in the beginning, by the way, this is Reish Lakish of Gittin, Samach Amud Aleph. We'll make the connection maybe more b'derech Dush. Shebetchila, in the beginning, Kishnishtacha Torah Yisrael, when Torah was forgotten for the Jewish people, whatever that means. Allah Ezra mi Bavel. Ezra went up, came from Bavel. V'yasta, he established it. Whatever that means. Chazav v'nishtacha, it's forgotten again. Allah Hillel Bala v'yasta. Chazav v'nishtacha, Allah Rabchil Bala v'yastura. What's nishtacha? I want to claim that each point we have the emergence of a new text. Very simply, what's the text of Ezra? You could say simply, based upon the Gemara and Chaf Aleph and Beis in Sanhedrin, that in fact Ezra, right, changed the lashon of the Torah, the Ksav of the Torah, not Chas v'Shalom, changed the Ksav of the Torah, but went to lashon, right, like the Gemara in Sanhedrin, right? In other words, we see that the Torah now is given b'lashon Ashuris and lashon HaKodesh v'Ksav Ashuris.
Even if we don't say the language was changed.
No, the Chas v'Shalom, the language wasn't changed. Chas v'Shalom, the Ritva and Megillah. I just want to say is we see that for the Hamayim,
compilation of Anshikas Agdola. Codified.
Whatever the Torah was read, transmitted to the Hamayim, like the Ritva says, right? However, the text of the Torah that was transmitted to the Hamayim in the lush of the Ritva and Megillah, of course, Chas v'Shalom, the Torah given to Moshe Rabbeinu was given b'Ksav Ashuris, right? Because from that we learn Tili Shal Halachas, and also to b'Lashon HaKodesh, Ksav Ashuris. Nonetheless, because of what Kedushosa, the Ritva says that the Torah, as it was transmitted, that was given to the Hamayim, was given in different Lashonis, Lav Nundes, etc., Lashon Ivri. In any case, we see that Ezra plays a very, very important role here. That's Nishtacha v'Yastura.
The Gemara Megillah says he canonized Tanakh.
Fine. Now, let's go further. Hillel, I want to claim, well, we've spoken about this. The first list of midas, the Tosefta and Sanhedrin, he was Deiresh, Sheva midas in front of Bnei Beseira. That's a new type of a text. See the shiurim on the Yud Gimel, midas HaTorah Nidrashes Behem. Reb Chia, I want to claim also too, we'll speak about this. Reb Chia is in fact, the Tosefta. But it's very, very important. Yeah.
Hillel, Midas, Rabbi Triebitz is saying that Hillel is also the introduction of a written
It's a new type of an oral text.
An oral text.
The midas represent a type of an oral text. Actually, we spoke about that.
But we're not saying written.
No, this is oral.
Ezra wrote.
That's true, but we could say that since it was the Torah that was used by the Hamoin Am, and not...
That's what I was written.
So therefore it's a type of an oral text too in Ezra. That's what I want to say. Chas v'shalom. But that's what I want to say. That's, in other words, there was a type of a talgum, a tilgum. In any case, what I want to bring these as two rayas, two sources of this statement, the Rav Sherira Gaon. We see that Chazal were very, very aware of the fact. Something called Nishtacha Torah. Nishtacha Torah doesn't mean we forget the Torah. But rather, in a certain sense, there's no longer a textless oral tradition. And then a text is established. And now, the future generations, the post-textual generations, what they do is they darshan, they try to understand, they interpret the text. And that's called the shtacha of the previous oral tradition. Lafi aniyas daiti, that's why I want to learn the Gemara. Okay? Now, this concept of a oral tradition before a text appears in none other than Rab Tzadok HaKohen in Rasisei Laila. It's in section Mem Vav.
What page?
Daf Mem Vav Amud Daled, or in the English, this is all the old edition, where those of us who are a certain age only look at the old editions, on page 92. So it's interesting that here, that Rab Tzadok HaKohen makes this crucial jump, which we're going to leave you on a limb right now, to the written, the Torah Shebechsav. Says Rab Tzadok, of course, this is part of a very long maimer, long discussion, Gedalko B'Kodesh, Uvetchilas Habriya Gam Torah Shebechsav Hayam Mechlal Devarim Shebechsav. The beginning, Torah Shebechsav was also part of Torah Shebechsav, says Rab Tzadok. Shadayin Lo Nitna Torah. The Torah wasn't given yet, meaning there wasn't a text yet. V'Torah Shebechsav Atzma, the Torah Shebechsav itself. Moshe Rabbeinu apprehended the Torah Shebechsav for Miklal Torah Shebe'al Peh, and it was part of Torah Shebe'al Peh. Al derech hasagas hadavim shu Torah Shebe'al Peh. And then afterwards, when the Torah was given, then it became a certain sense of a text. Or we could learn in the Gemara and Gittin. I don't want to go into the details right now. In Rab Tzadok HaKohen, we clearly see, and this is what I'm calling the oral tradition of the written law, that there was a hasaga, hanavuis, a prophetic apprehension of Moshe Rabbeinu, before the Torah became a text. Before it became a text. Very, very interesting. And there's a lot of arichas. There's a tremendous amount to go in here. This is, Rab Tzadok actually speaks out some very interesting ideas. And so we see this is this one aspect of the text, which means the creation of a text from a textless oral tradition. And this is Shitas Reish Lakish. Now, what I want to say is the Memra that I brought in Sukkah, in Chafam and Aleph, who's the Bala Memra that speaks about the creation of a textual tradition, is none other than Reish Lakish. And it's very much Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish begins, Hareini kaparas Rab Chiu Banav. I'm a kapar Chiu Banav. And the last textual creation is Nishtacha ol Rab Chiu Banav Yazdua. Reish Lakish understood himself as involved in this creation of a text. That's why he's kaparas Rab Chiu Banav. That's Reish Lakish. Okay.
What was the text Reish Lakish was creating?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Okay? Many miles to go before we sleep. Okay. In summary, we've established, I think, rather clearly, that there's a clear concept of the creation of a text from a textless oral tradition. Of course, that's one concept of text. There are two concepts of text. There's a concept of textual redaction of a text, which we'll get to maybe next time, maybe the time afterwards. I want to elaborate more on some of the ideas we expressed today. And this appears to be the opinion, or the understanding of Rabbi Yochanan's, of Reish Lakish's statement in Gittin Samach Amud Aleph in describing the text of the Torah Shebechsav. In any case,